Okay, Michael, we're on. You can see the screen share.
Yes, I can, and I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me. I want to thank Stephen Shore for putting this wonderful conference together, and I want to give a special shout out to John Papadopoulos, who, with skill and great patience and humor, gets my tech going. And I'm glad he's standing by. I want to start out by telling you a story, a true story that happened to me on November 19th of 2022. I had developed a serious cardiac arrhythmia. I was having recurrent ventricular tachycardia, and I was having it for about 7 years. And I had 3 ablations. They didn't last. And that my clinical condition was getting worse, and I was stuck in ventricular tachycardia in a hospital bed on a high dose of intravenous lidocaine. Things were getting pretty serious. And I had a wonderful procedure by two world-class electrophysiologists. One electrophysiologist went in my femoral vein the way an ablation is usually done, and the other one went through my chest wall with a catheter that could be threaded into the pericardial lining of my heart. And the two electrophysiologists together were mapping the source of the ventricular tachycardia and doing it. They could do it because there were two sensors. They could do it in 3 dimensions, and they could find out how deep in my heart tissue the aberrant signals were coming from. And they ablated the aberrancy. And since then, the last 6 months, I've not had any problem. And it appears that they cured me, and my life was in serious danger without that procedure. I was lying in the ICU the day after the procedure, and a cardiologist, not an electrophysiologist, but a cardiologist came by to make rounds. And he pulled up a chair the way good doctors do. And he knew that I knew something about statins, and he wanted to discuss the issue with me, cholesterol lowering and statins. And he wanted me to take an additional drug called Vytorin or ezetimibe to lower my cholesterol further, even though the problem that I was having didn't have anything to do with cholesterol. And I was looking at him in the chair that he had pulled up to my bed, and I could see him with one eye, and I could see the cardiac monitor with the other eye, and I didn't know whether I was cured or not. And I could see, as I was talking to him, I could watch and see on the monitor whether the premature ventricular contractions were recurring and whether I was in danger. And he suggested that I take more cholesterol-lowering medication. And I said to him, I know the study you're talking about. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, but they didn't choose the right endpoint. The endpoint they chose included revascularization procedures, which are subjective and can be determined or affected by a patient's level of LDL. And those patients who have higher LDL are more likely to have revascularization procedures. So the studies that include revascularization procedures in the outcome of heart attacks, strokes, and cardiovascular deaths are diluting the message that's coming about the drug that really benefits people. So I said to him that, and he responded, well, I understand that, but the drug company, it would be very expensive to do the study the other way because there wouldn't be so many endpoints. And I said to him, I can understand that, but it's the drug company's responsibility, not the patient's responsibility or the doctor's responsibility to do the study right. So we didn't quite get to agreement there, but I'm looking at the monitor. I'm still doing okay. And I said to him, do you know that when a paper is published in the New England Journal of Medicine or the JAMA or any of the other respected journals, and it's peer-reviewed, do you know that the peer reviewers don't get to see the actual data, that they're relying on the manufacturer's presentation of the data in most cases? And he sort of sheepishly said, yes, I do know that. And he tried to mitigate the importance of that by saying at the New England Journal, they require that clinical trialists submit protocols and statistical analysis plans so that there's some check to make sure that the study's been analyzed properly. And I said, but that's all good. But if they don't have the data, it's not really evidence-based medicine, because you can't have evidence without data. And then my cardiac monitor was okay. I was having no PVCs, and I figured I might as well keep going. So I said to him, how can you possibly present yourself as a learned intermediary, telling your patients and your colleagues and the people who respect your cardiological expertise, how can you possibly present yourself as a learned intermediary when the evidence that you're relying on, has not been independently evaluated? And at that point, my monitor was still okay. I'm not sure the cardiologist was feeling so good. And we decided to end the conversation. But there I was in an ICU, modern medicine having saved my life. And this very competent academic cardiologist is acknowledging to me that what he's accepting as evidence-based medicine has not been independently vetted. And that is a major part of the core problem that I'm going to talk to you about today. Just conflicts of interest. I'm the author of Sickening: How Big Pharma Broke American Healthcare and How We Can Repair It. And in the past year, I've served as a plaintiff's expert in litigation involving Celgene and the drugs thalidomide and Revlimid, and in a case involving GlaxoSmithKline about the diabetes drug Avandia. So I want to present an overview of what I'm going to talk about, and then we'll get down into the details. But before I do that, I want to say that this lecture, or previous iterations of this lecture, I've presented to a group of 50 PhD students from Harvard and MIT in their science and health technology program. These are very sophisticated, very smart, and intellectually not bashful folks. And I presented it a month ago to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill Department of Medicine Grand Rounds. So this is, what I'm going to show you is not watered down. And I don't want to scare you and think that I'm going to be talking over your head, because it's going to be a lot easier for you folks to understand what I'm saying than it is for the people who are being brought in, indoctrinated might be slightly too strong a word, but brought into the medical world and being taught what they should accept as legitimate information. And I think you're going to see that this is so contrary to common sense and decency, but you'll be able to see it much better than the practitioners of medicine. So I'm going to present you an overview which will compare Americans' health and healthcare to that of other wealthy nations. And then I want to dive into my area of expertise, which is how the pharmaceutical industry is changing the sources of information that are available to doctors, and how they are doing that with the primary motivation of maximizing their investors' financial return on investment, not the American public's health or our economic well-being. So the largest unrecognized cause of doctors and other healthcare professionals' belief about optimal care being taken away from an epidemiologically balanced approach to healthcare and a factually based approach to healthcare, the largest impediment is that the drug companies and commercial interests are manipulating the knowledge that is presented to doctors and other healthcare professionals in the way that they've been taught to receive it. And fundamentally, there are two issues. What is the new knowledge? And notice the quotation marks around knowledge. What is the new knowledge about? And let's define knowledge as a justified true belief. We're not talking about knowledge as 2 + 2 = 4. It's not absolute knowledge that doctors rely on. The knowledge that they rely on is created in a social context the fundamental purpose of which is to maximize those financial returns to the investors. But doctors are taught to accept the so-called evidence-based medicine that's presented in peer-reviewed journals, even though the peer reviewers don't get to look at the data independently. They're taught to accept that as knowledge. And we want to keep in front of mind that what they're accepting as knowledge may not be true knowledge. And then secondly, so what is the knowledge about? Is it about the right thing? And then secondly, is the knowledge that's being presented to them accurate and reasonably complete? And then finally, at the end of the lecture, I want to talk briefly about meaningful reforms, which have to improve the epidemiological balance of the knowledge base that is brought to them, and has to improve the trustworthiness of the scientific information that they have to accept as the evidence in evidence-based medicine. And before those reforms can be even begun to be implemented, we've got to figure out all together, how to overcome the powerful resistance of the commercial status quo. So let's start with just a quick view, 4 perspectives on ethics, because there are ethical presumptions in what I'm going to say. And I think we can all agree on these general statements. The first, from Confucius, from 500 BC, he states it in the negative. He says, what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. If you don't want to get drugs prescribed by doctors based on false information, don't create false information and give it to doctors. Matthew 7:12 says it, flips it, and turns it into a positive statement. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets, the golden rule. Immanuel Kant made the same kind of ethical statement, not based on religious principles. This is his categorical imperative. Act only according to the maxim by which you can at the same time, act only according to the maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Act in a way that would work if we all acted that way. And then finally, John Rawls wrote a book, A Theory of Justice, in 1971, and he put forth the notion of a veil of ignorance as a way to determine what would make a just society. And he proposed that social policy should be made by people who don't know what their role in society is going to be when they start to live in the society they've designed. So in this talk, I'd like you to think about maybe we have a drug company CEO and a researcher and a doctor and a patient and a taxpayer all at the table. And we're going to try to figure out the best way to help doctors to understand the best way to take care of their patients. So let's just use that as a background that we'll think about what's the issues that I'm going to discuss. So first, an overview of American medicine, and I'll be very interested in the questions afterwards. If somebody or if folks could tell me how much of this they knew already, and how much is new material. So if you're going to ask a question after I'm done, please note the slide number. The slide number is down here in the lower right corner of the slide when you ask the question. And I think we all know that American healthcare is not living up to its potential, and it's very expensive. But I'm going to fill in some of the details here. So this is a graph that looks at life expectancy here on the vertical axis between 72 and 86 years. And it looks at the years between 1980 and 2021. And it plots life expectancy at birth. And the green line is the United States, life expectancy in the United States as the years go along. And the blue line is life expectancy in 10 comparable countries. wealthy countries. And you can see in 1982 is an important year to me because that's the year I hung out my shingle and started my family practice. And the United States was almost up to the other countries. It was 0.6 years behind in life expectancy at that point. And you can see how these curves separate as time goes on and then separate acutely at the very end. And I want to divide these years into three different periods. Between 1980 and 2014, we were living 0.6 years less than the citizens of other wealthy countries in 1982. And by 2014, we were living 3.3 years less than the citizens of the other countries. So we know we're spending a lot of money and we're losing ground. Then we get to the period of 2014 to 2019. Now, this is a very informative period because approximately a third of Americans were uninsured. 17% of Americans were uninsured. And when Obamacare was passed in 2010, but it didn't come into effect until 2014. There were 42 million Americans who were uninsured when Obamacare came into effect in 2014. By 2019, that number had gone down to 28 million Americans. So about a third of the uninsured Americans got insurance during those years. And that's a good thing. We think everybody should have insurance. But look what happened. Life expectancy did not go up. The economy was growing in the United States. We were doing well. Obama was president through 2017, and then Trump took over, and we had a strong economy. And yet, despite America's spending, our life expectancy wasn't going up, while life expectancy in the other countries was going up. So then we get to 2019, just before the COVID pandemic starts, and here we go, 2020, 2020 and 21, and we see that life expectancy in the other wealthy countries declined in 2020, and then it went up and recovered most of the way in 2021, whereas life expectancy in the United States just took a nosedive. So we were 3.4 years behind the other countries before the COVID pandemic, and we were 6.3 years behind the other countries after the second year of the pandemic. Americans were living 6.3 years less than the citizens of the other wealthy countries. Now, this is data from 2021. Here we see the other countries are living 82.4 years average. We're living 76.1 years. That's a 6.3 year difference. And to achieve our 6.3 years less of life expectancy, we're spending $12,900 per person per year. And the average of the other 10 countries is $6,000 per year. Now, this is an enormous amount of extra spending. If we subtract 12,914, is 6,003 from 12,914, we're spending $6,911 extra for every American every year on healthcare. And if we multiply that number by $334 million, it shows that we are spending an excess $2.3 trillion a year. That's like 3 times more than the Defense Department budget. We're spending an excess $2.3 trillion a year. And the result, the effect on our health is that we're losing so much ground that Americans now live more than 6 years, that lifespans are more than 6 years shorter than the citizens of 10 other wealthy countries. Now, that's bad enough, but I think it's important to look at the equity of the situation. And the blue line is life expectancy in 2019 before the pandemic. The aqua line is 2020, the first year of the pandemic, and the green line is 2021. So for white Americans, they started out in 2019 with a life expectancy of 78.8 years, and it went down 2.2 years in the first 2 years of the pandemic. For Black Americans, they started out at 74.8 years, 4 years less than white Americans, And it went down not 2.4 years, but it went down 4 years during the first 2 years of the pandemic. And for American Indians and Alaskan Natives, they lost 6.6 years of life. So not only is overall American longevity poor, but the less fortunate among us, the minorities among us, are getting the short end of the stick, and their health is much more vulnerable to something like the COVID pandemic. Now, we might feel comfortable if we're wealthy, if we're lucky enough to have a college education and a professional job, and we're able to read, we have the skill and the training to read medical information, that we're in a good position to get the best of American healthcare and not get the worst of it that's dragging down our numbers. Here's a very interesting study that compared health outcomes in white citizens, wealthy white citizens, to those of average Americans and the average citizens of the other 10 countries we've been referring to. And what the first part of what they found is not surprising at all, that white citizens in the wealthiest 1% and 5% highest income counties have better health outcomes than average Americans. No surprise there. But here's a surprise. The white citizens who live in the 1% and 5% highest income counties have worse health than the average citizens of the other 10 wealthy countries. The citizens, we have worse outcomes for infant and maternal mortality, colon cancer, childhood acute lymphocytic leukemia, and acute myocardial infarction. The wealthy white Americans have worse outcomes than the average citizens in the other countries. So this is a slightly more refined way to look at longevity. This is overall age-adjusted mortality rate per 100,000 in the population between 1980 and 2017. And the reason why this is slightly more accurate than simple longevity is that different countries have different age populations. So Italy's population is quite a bit older than the United States', and they're going to have a higher death rate. But the World Health Organization creates standardized population age distributions for population, so that when you look at the death rates and correct them for the standardized distribution, you can make an accurate comparison of the death rates between different countries. And now, again, we're comparing the United States is green, and the 10 wealthy countries are blue. If we go back to 1980, we can, let me show you. If we go back to 1980, the death rate in the other countries is higher than ours. And if you subtract the death rate in the other countries from ours per 100,000 citizens and multiply that by 334 million Americans, 194,000 Americans fewer died in 1980 than would be predicted from the average age-adjusted mortality rate in the other countries. But if we come out to 2017, long before COVID ever hit, we see these lines have crossed. Now the green line has a higher age-adjusted mortality rate. And around 1987, it went higher, and it stayed higher and kept getting higher long before COVID hit. And the age-adjusted death rate in the United States was 840 per 100,000, minus 693 in the other countries, times 334 million people in the United States, shows that in 2017, almost 500,000 excess deaths occurred in the United States because our health and healthcare is so inferior to the other wealthy countries. Now, I want to put 500,000 deaths a year in perspective. COVID was terrible. It was the worst health crisis that I've seen in my lifetime, which is going back further and further. And COVID caused 1.1 million deaths in 2020, 21, and 22. It caused 1.1 million Americans to lose their life. But just because our age-adjusted mortality rate is so much higher than the other countries before COVID. More than the death rate from just the disparity in our health and healthcare is 50% worse than the entire death rate from COVID in the United States. So this is an enormous, I mean, we heard COVID on the headlines every day, and we should have, but we should be hearing this every day, 50% more, because this is taking 50% more lives than COVID did at its worst. And I find this just completely shocking. And then this is kind of the last straw. This is a complicated chart. It looks simple, but it's not. On the vertical axis, we see healthy life expectancy, and we're still comparing the same 10 countries to the United States. We see healthy life expectancy on the vertical axis. And on the horizontal axis, we're not seeing money or years. Excuse me, we're not seeing years. We're seeing how much money is spent on healthcare. And as you can see, the comparable countries got to much higher life expectancy, and their spending was way lower because they're on the left side of the graph, whereas the United States went out to the right side. Now, but this graph is interesting because it adds a third dimension. It adds the date when these health results were achieved. And if we draw a line, this is before the COVID started. If we draw a line in the United States, when our life expectancy was approximately, call it 76 or 7, the United States was here. When the other countries had a life expectancy of what ours was in 1997, they achieved that life expectancy, our life expectancy in 2019 was the same as the other country's life expectancy in 1997. All the money, all the innovation, all the great discoveries, and the United States didn't catch up in life expectancy to the other countries. From 1997, we didn't catch up until 2019. And when the other countries were achieving that life expectancy, they were spending approximately $2,500 per person on healthcare, and we were spending almost $11,000 per person on healthcare to achieve that longevity. Now, this is where it gets particularly shocking. This is in 2021, after 2 years of COVID. The United States is here. We're spending $12,000 plus per year on healthcare for everybody, and our life expectancy is approximately 76. And if we go back and find out when the other countries had a life expectancy equal to the American life expectancy in 2021, you have to go all the way back to 1986. So the health of Americans is now equal to what the health of the other countries, citizens of the other countries, was in 1986. And at that point, the other countries were spending $1,000 per person, and we're spending almost $13,000 per person. This is how ineffective and inefficient the United States' approach to health and healthcare is. Now, I want to take a dive. Well, first, let me say that Nobel laureate in economics, Angus Deaton, and Angus Deaton is the author of a book called Diseases of Despair with his wife. They're both economics professors at Princeton. And Angus Deaton, Nobel laureate, wrote in a review of a healthcare book in the New York Times, American healthcare does a poor job of delivering health, but is exquisitely designed as an inequality machine, commanding an ever larger share of GDP and funneling resources to the top of the income distribution. And that's because those people are the ones who are investing in healthcare and making private equity investments and direct investments in healthcare, so that the money that they're making is being taken from working Americans. And in my book, Sickening, I start out the introduction by explaining that after the first 9 months or so of the vaccine, the COVID vaccine being used, and thank God it was available and it saved many lives, but after the first 9 months or so, the 17 billionaires had made $50 billion in profit from the vaccines. And at that time, the World Health Organization, the IMF, and the World Bank were begging for $50 billion so that they could distribute vaccinations to the third world. And they didn't get the $50 billion that the billionaires had pocketed. So this is a perfect example of how healthcare serves, healthcare innovation serves as a way to redistribute wealth upward. So what's the primary goal of American healthcare? And if anyone has a better answer than this, please let's talk about it during the comments. But I think a good approximation of what the primary goal of healthcare ought to be is to maintain and improve individual and population health most effectively, efficiently, and equitably. So this raises two questions. If that's a reasonable statement of the goal, why are we failing so miserable on the achievement of this goal? And the second question is, why are doctors and other healthcare professionals willing to go along with this dysfunctional system? Like the doctor that I spoke to in the ICU while I was having my functional stress test to see if my conversation with him would set off my ventricular tachycardia. So there are a lot of problems here, but the four problems in American healthcare account for about 2/3 of the difference in spending between the United States and the other wealthy countries. Number one is pharmaceuticals. Number two is expensive procedures. Number three is administrative costs. And number four is imaging procedures. But pharmaceuticals are the greatest cause of the rising cost of American healthcare. And now I want to narrow this talk down and say that the primary problem in this part of the issue is that the drug companies and other commercial interests have captured what doctors and other healthcare professionals accept as medical knowledge. It's not necessarily true, but it's what their education and training has taught them to accept as medical knowledge. And this is the unspoken problem. And I have to say, Sickening was published a little over a year ago, and it's been stunning how the mainstream press won't talk about this issue. I mean, this is an issue that's taking 50% more lives than COVID did at its worst, or during the 3 years that it was at its worst. And there's no coverage of this issue in the news. So what happened? How did we get here? How did this transition occur? This is an article from the journal Science from 1982 that really describes the transition, the pivot in American medicine. And if you remember, 1982 is approximately the time when Americans' longevity started to fall behind the other countries and our costs started to go up. So in 1982, this article titled "The Academic Industrial Complex" in the medical journal Science, or the journal Science, wrote that grants from the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation are fewer in number and harder to get. So university researchers and the universities' academic medical centers themselves had no option but to turn to alternative sources for research support. They needed to do it to meet their budgets, and the researchers needed to do it to use their God-given talent to do medical research and try and make a contribution to society. Prior to this, it wasn't really respectable for professors to have financial ties to commercial interests. But this is a quote from that article in Science, where Barbara Culleton wrote, "Scientists who 10 years ago, from 1982, who 10 years ago would have snubbed their academic noses at industrial money, now eagerly seek it out. So from being kind of a dirty thing to do, to take commercial money because the research ought to be completely unbiased and not have any conflicts of interest, from doing that, taking money from drug companies and of not just status within the profession, but status in terms of promotion, and rather than being evidence of a willingness to work with people who are doing this for the purpose of making money instead of making people healthier most effectively and efficiently, instead of that being a criticizable decision, it became a sign of prestige. Along with the grant money drying up from the feds, the Bayh-Dole Act was passed in 1980. This was, you needed as much gray hair as I have to remember this. But in 1980, Japanese cars were coming in and taking over the US market. And this was revolutionary. We never got Japanese cars. There were a few imported cars, Jaguar and BMW, but there weren't Japanese cars, but they were high quality and they were inexpensive. And Japanese transistor radios and semiconductor products commanded the market. And there was a belief, whether it was true or not, that the government of Japan was funding an industrial policy. So they were funding the commercial entities and giving them an advantage over other international economies. And the way the United States approached neutralizing Japan's perceived advantage was to pass the Bayh-Dole Act and say, those academic researchers, in particular medical researchers and academic medical centers, who are working with federal money, federal grant money, and develop products that are patentable, and the patents are have economic value, they're allowed to keep that economic value, all of the economic value. They don't have to pay it back. Now, that worked very well to get people motivated to commercialize the discoveries they were making with federal money. But what it did is it changed the function of the university. It became so that now it's standard for universities to be motivated by translational medicine departments, and that's a matter of status. And what translational medicine is, it means translating science into money. Doesn't mean translating it into health. It means translating it into money. And in the same article from 1982, Barbara Culleton quoted the president of Harvard, Derek Bach, expressing presciently and precisely spotting how this was going to play out. And let me just read this. In 1981, Derek Bach described universities' reliance on industry funding for research as, quote, causing quote, an uneasy sense that programs to exploit technological development are likely to confuse the university's central commitment to the pursuit of knowledge. Now, this is huge. It's huge because the universities, they're nonprofit, the universities played a role in society to be the overseer of the integrity and the relevance of knowledge. And suddenly they became in the marketplace. They were in the game. And the departments in academic medical centers, they were trying to get research money and they were trying to make money. And now the most prestigious universities, Harvard Medical School, they brag about the extent of the translational medicine effort in the overall function of the medical school. That's what medical schools have become. The more prestigious they are, the more they are able to get federal funding, do the research, and turn it into capital and get venture capital and private equity involved in it. And they make a lot of money. But what Angus Deaton, the Nobel laureate economist, said is that this is a great way to transfer wealth from the American people up to the wealthy people. But it's not a great way to make the American people healthier and have a better society. So this leaves us with two questions about the knowledge that came under this commercial influence. The first question is the new medical knowledge that informs healthcare professionals and policymakers epidemiologically balanced? Is the research being done about the right thing to make Americans as healthy as they can be most effectively and efficiently? And to answer this question, we go to an article that was published. This article was published in JAMA in 2015, and it was called The Anatomy of Medical Research. This is a quote from the article. It says that the United States spends $16 billion annual. This data is a little old. The article was published in 2015. But the United States spends $16 billion annually on research directed at new drugs and devices, but only $5 billion aimed at health services research, which examines access to care, the quality and cost of care, and the health and well-being of individuals, communities, and populations. So we're spending 96% of our research money. We're spending 96% of our research money on new drugs and medical devices, and only 4% of our research money on the population health of Americans. Why the disparity in investment? I think you folks can guess. One major difference, and I would say the primary difference, is that new drugs and devices command favorable prices, and their value accrues directly to the firm that invests in them and the people who invest in them. In contrast, service innovations that can reduce morbidity and mortality while also reducing cost, but financial returns to innovators may be negligible or even negative. And I reviewed a book by a professor of political science in Yale who described eloquently in the early 1900s how the AMA was so critical of public health measures because it was it was decreasing doctors' incomes. That cholera, to clean up the water supply and get rid of cholera, was a tremendous impediment to doctors' salaries. And that's basically what these folks are saying 100 years later, is that we're looking for new medical, the medical research, which is where our knowledge comes from. We're looking for new knowledge based on what's going to produce the greatest financial return on investment to the researchers and the commercial entities that sponsor the research, and not how we're best going to improve Americans' health. So what we get, this is called a homunculus, and this grotesque figure of a human being represents the disproportionate nerve innervation in the brain representation of these anatomic parts, the sensory part of the brain to these anatomic parts, obviously to help us get food and eat food and be sexual and so forth. But it's a grotesque representation of a human being. And what I want to show is that how we allocate our research is just as grotesque as this homunculus. Because the determinants of health are 20% health, 20% of our health is determined by healthcare. 30% of health behaviors, 20% of our health is determined by healthcare. 30% of our health is determined by health behaviors. 40% of our health is determined by socioeconomic factors, and 10% by the physical environment. So what we have in the homunculus of the knowledge that we're producing is that we've got 96% of that knowledge talking about drugs and devices, which address at most 20% of the problem. And we've got 4% of our research addressing this 80% of the problem. It's a complete misallocation of our research funds. And that's the knowledge that doctors read in their medical journals and accept as evidence-based medicine. So the second question, it's the knowledge is not epidemiologically based, not proportionally to what we need, but even so, is the scientific evidence derived from clinical trials accurate and reasonably complete? And what I'm going to show you is not so much. Back in 1991, before this graph starts in 1994, but the graph is the proportion of commercially sponsored, the percentage of research that is done by commercial entities or in academic settings from 94 to 2004. And 91 is not a data point that was included in this graph, but in 91, 80% of research was done in academic medical centers and 20% was done by commercial entities. 80% in academic medical centers. But you can see by 2004, the 80% of research that had been done in academic medical centers went down to 26%. And the drug companies and device companies took over control of the rest of that research. This is where things really changed. Drummond Rennie was the associate editor or deputy editor of JAMA in 1999, I think. And as the proportion of research that was being done in academic medical centers was going down, he wrote in 99 that this was creating a race to the ethical bottom for research funds. And what he meant by that is as the universities, academic medical centers, got less and less money to do their research, when it was siphoned off and given to private contract research organizations, the academic medical centers had to agree to the same terms that the contract research organizations were willing to work on, the same terms, or they wouldn't get any money at all. Drummond Rennie said this is a race to the ethical bottom. Let me show you the consequences. This is an article. The next slide is from an article that was done that looked at the research contracts between drug companies and universities in 2004 and what the terms of those research contracts were that caused Drummond Rennie to say it was a race to the ethical bottom. So this article was done by surveying the contracting offices in academic medical centers and asking them the terms that they would accept in a research contract with a drug company. And one question was, in your best judgment, would you allow a clause in a multi-center clinical research trial agreement saying that the sponsor will own the data produced by the research? Own the data. 80% of the contracts that academic medical centers signed with drug and device companies allowed the sponsor of the research, the commercial sponsor of the research, to own that data. Now, owning the data is really important. This is a slide from litigation. It's not litigation I was in, but a slide from litigation. It was about Zoloft and Pfizer. This is an internal document from Pfizer, and it's talking about Pfizer's view of data ownership. And it says all the studies belong to Pfizer, but look at the second bullet point. This is just stunning. And this is the kind of thing in the introduction, let me clarify it a little bit. I was a family doc for 20 years, but when I got my teeth into the FDA's data about Vioxx and realized that the New England Journal article that told us doctors that Vioxx is a safer drug and we should use it over conventional anti-inflammatory drugs, when I saw the FDA data and realized that that was absolutely wrong and the FDA knew it was wrong and Merck was marketing as if it was safe and the New England Journal wasn't correcting it, I left practice in 2002 to write my first book, which is Overdosed America, about these issues. And I spent, Vioxx was pulled from the market a week after my book came out. It wasn't my doing directly because another study showed that Vioxx increased the risk of heart attack and stroke. But I had written the last book and I was all over the TV, the Today Show and so forth. And lawyers saw me and lawyers started to ask me to participate as an expert in national litigation. And I spent about 10 years in national litigation. And during that time, signing a confidentiality agreement, but I got to see the inside of the drug company's computers. Literally, the hard drives are dumped into databases, and you can put the whole thing together. And this, again, this is not litigation I was in, but this information that came from that process is critically important because you find out what they're really doing, not what they say they're doing. That we're dedicated to helping people live happier and fuller lives and so forth. This is what they're really doing. They say the purpose of data, Pfizer says this, the purpose of data is to support directly or indirectly marketing of our product. There's no sugarcoating here. They're doing research to support their marketing. Now, the first bullet is through the use of label enhancements and supplemental new drug application filings. That's fine. That means that a drug that's been approved by the FDA, they're doing studies on, and they want to get approval for another indication that the FDA hasn't yet approved, and that's completely legit, and we want drug companies to do that. But then the second bullet says they're going to support marketing of their product through publications for field force use. In plain English, this means that they're doing the research to be published in medical journals, peer-reviewed medical journals. Remember that the peer reviewers don't have access to the data, so they don't know if the data is actually true and complete or not. But through publications for field force use, that means for their drug reps to hand out to doctors as a sales tool. Now, this issue of drug companies buying reprints from the journals to hand out as marketing tools is a major issue in the commercial deception of doctors. Because what happens is this is a major source of journals' income, selling reprints. For example, the Lancet provided data in 2005. The other big journals didn't, but the Lancet did. And the Lancet showed that in 2005, 41% of its revenues came from selling reprints to the drug companies to hand out for the sales reps to hand out to the doctors. 41% of its income. Now, that creates the biggest conflict of interest of all, because the journals want to publish the articles that are going to have financial value for the drug companies to buy back and hand out to the doctors. And that creates a tremendously strong incentive for the journals to participate in this sham peer review where there isn't independent analysis of the manuscripts that are published, but the journals use their prestige to make it look like there's been independent peer review. And then they use, and then Pfizer admits, and this probably cost them a good deal of money because this is illegal, through publications that can be utilized to support off-label data dissemination. Now, it's not illegal to study off-label uses of drugs, and it's not illegal for drug reps to bring those articles that discuss off-label uses of drugs to doctors' offices. But it is illegal for drug reps to talk to doctors about that. And I can tell you that I've seen many cases in which the drug companies' marketing strategies include getting these articles published that support off-label use, and that they are consciously sending their drug reps out to market their products off-label and illegally from the FDA's point of view. And then finally, they say, therefore, commercial marketing and medical, the marketing department and the medical department need to be involved in all data dissemination efforts. And I'm going to show you in a minute why that is so important. But to go back to the study about the researching the terms of the contracts between the academic medical centers and the drug companies, here we see 24% of the contracts allow the sponsor to include its own statistical analyses in the manuscripts. Now, the peer reviewers haven't been able to see the actual data, and a quarter of the contracts say the sponsors can put their own data in and nobody can do anything about it. And this is the one that really is shocking to me. Half of the contracts allow the sponsor to write up the results for publication, and the investigators, the researchers, Sponsors writing it up. The researchers can review the manuscript and suggest revisions, but there's no guarantee that those revisions will be accepted. So what this bottom line is saying is that 50% of the contracts between academic medical centers and drug companies allow the commercial sponsor of the research to ghostwrite the article, and the actual researchers can't change it. They can only suggest changes. Their only recourse is to resign from the project, give up the money and the prestige that they would glean if the article were published. So this is the situation we're in. We've got a good doctor, or maybe it's a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant, who's looking for evidence-based medicine, who wants to practice in accord with the principles that they've been trained to follow, evidence-based medicine. And they're so committed, they named their boat Scientific Evidence, and they've got a little doctor bag or nurse or physician assistant bag in the back. And then with a telescope, this healthcare professional is looking at the public information that's above the waterline. This is going to be an iceberg, this stuff below the waterline. But they can only see what's above the waterline. And what they see is peer-reviewed journal articles. But remember, the peer reviewers didn't get to look at the data. And they say clinical practice guidelines. But those clinical practice guidelines that set the standard of medical care and can be brought into malpractice cases if doctors and other professionals don't follow them. So they're looking at the clinical practice guidelines as evidence-based medicine, and they're not aware that the guidelines are based on the articles that have not been peer-reviewed, and that the experts who write the clinical guidelines don't have access to the data either. So the clinical practice guidelines are an echo of the commercial bias in the original published articles. And then there's drug company marketing, and you might say, well, good doctors aren't going to fall for that. But there's no way to avoid it. Maybe they don't let drug reps into their office, but it doesn't matter, because the experts that they rely on and the grand rounds that they go to and the conferences they go to and the CME dinners and the CME vacations that they go to, the drug companies all play a major role in those sources of information. So our good healthcare practitioner trying to do the right thing for his or her patients is basically promulgating the commercial vision of how to practice medicine. And what the doctors don't know, and when I lecture and I present these slides, I ask the audience, how many of you know that peer reviewers don't get to see the real data? About 2% of the doctors know that. What this doctor doesn't know is where this information came from. And where it came from is when a drug company is doing a clinical trial, they fill out case report forms. The trial, whoever's running the trial, fills out case report forms for each visit of each patient in a clinical trial. And that shows what their lab results are and what their clinical situation is. And generally, they ask non-specific questions about side effects, but they don't ask pressing questions or prospective questions about side effects. So, for example, we don't know what the side effect rate of statins are for people who are taking statins to lower their cholesterol. And the reason why we don't know what the side effect is that only 1 out of 44 studies actually asked prospectively, are you having muscle symptoms? Are you having specific side effects? Only 1 study asked that. So the information goes into the case report forms. The case report forms it's a huge volume of information that's transferred into electronic patient level data sets. And then the electronic data level sets are turned into clinical study reports that are about 3,000 pages long. The clinical study reports tabulate the data in the electronic data sets and analyze them supposedly, and usually, from my experience in litigation, usually according to the statistical analysis plan that was committed to before the trial started, and the statistical analysis plan and the protocol for the study. So that 3,000-page document, which is prepared for virtually all clinical trials that can have any regulatory impact with the FDA, relevance with the FDA, get this 3,000 page clinical study report, but that never gets to the public unless it's unsealed in litigation. So I was at a conference at a very prestigious university, and I was walking out of the room with an editor, not a chief editor, but an editor of one of the very prestigious journals. And I said to that editor, I said, why don't you require that drug companies, when they submit manuscripts to your journal for publication, why don't you require that they have to also submit the clinical study report in a searchable form? Because it's already been done, and it contains most of the truth about what's gone on in the study. It wouldn't cost the drug company anything to supply that. And I had learned from my work in litigation that within 10 or 20 hours of going through a 3,000 page report that's searchable, I could find what I needed to know about whether the drug company did what they said they were going to do and analyzed it the way they said they were going to, and included the data that was relevant. So I said, why don't you just simply require that when an article is submitted reporting the results of a clinical trial, they have to submit the clinical study report as well? And that editor said to me, without missing a step, he said, because it would be a death spiral for the journal. It would be a death spiral for the journal. What did he mean? He meant that if his journal started to require clinical study reports, that the drug companies would take their commercially valuable studies to other journals to be published. And that journal would lose its impact factor. It would go down. It would lose its reprint sales, which is a significant source of revenue. And it would lose its advertising revenue from the drug company. So the journals know that they are giving in to the commercial sponsors of the research, and they're protecting their own financial interests. I'm going to show you a slide about the market failure in medical knowledge as we get to the end. So you say, well, the good healthcare professional here is looking at the scientific evidence, and why doesn't he just read the journals and expect to see what's in those journals? Well, it turns out when the published articles, completed trials are published, and they're published in journals, only 23% of the important outcomes are reported in the journals. Only 19% of benefit outcomes are reported in the journals, and only 26% of harm outcomes. And go back to the Vioxx story, which is a long time ago, but the New England Journal failed to require that the Merck, who's the sponsor of that trial for Vioxx, they failed to require that Merck include certain very important adverse events that would have changed the whole view of Vioxx being a safer drug. It turned out it was a far more dangerous drug, that 1 out of 40 people who took it had a serious adverse event. It wasn't safer, it was more dangerous, and it was no better. But that wasn't included in the journal article. The FDA knew it wasn't included in the journal article. The FDA doesn't make journals correct articles when they know they misrepresent the scientific data. And the New England Journal wouldn't go back and correct it, and didn't correct it until a year after the drug had been pulled, and one of their editors was going to be shown in a videotape deposition, and this was going to be, they were at risk of being exposed for not presenting the important information, and they tried to get out ahead of it. So they wrote an expression of concern editorial. But the drug had already been pulled for a year, and already about 50,000 Americans had died from taking Vioxx, again, a drug that was no better than over-the-counter anti-inflammatory drugs. So how do the journals do this? How do the drug companies get these biased reports published? How do they create it? So this is litigation I was in. Kaiser Health System sued Pfizer for fraudulently marketing their drug Neurontin, gabapentin now. It's available as a generic. They sued them for fraud, and they sued them for racketeering activities. And this is information that I and other team members on the plaintiff's team found in the database of Pfizer's documents about how they set out to fool the doctors. So this is what happens. They're talking about aligning their marketing messages with the data, clinical trial data. And they say, this is the situation that we don't want to happen. Top, I'm going to show you, there's another half to this slide. But if there's if they have clinical trial data, and what they do is they formulate marketing messages, the key messages, and the key messages are not based on science. They're based on what has been focus group tested to appeal to doctors and make doctors likely to prescribe the medicine and make patients likely to want the medicine. So they develop those marketing messages as not as scientific evidence, but as sales evidence. And they take their marketing messages and they put it into slide kits that they can show to doctors, and they take it to CME courses to show to doctors, and they make advertising monographs, and that they create sales material. And then they do studies, and they take their study data and they put it in abstracts, and that gets turned into manuscripts. And lo and behold, the marketing messages produce monographs that are different than the manuscripts that are based on the study data in the ideal world. And this leads to inconsistent key messages, and that's not good for drug sales. So this medical communications company, Medical Arts Communications, showed Pfizer there was a solution to this problem. What they would do is not develop the marketing messages, they would not develop the marketing messages and the study data independently. What they would do is get their study data, put it through a filter of their marketing messages, and only what was consistent with their marketing messages would then come out into the abstracts, posters, and manuscripts, and into their marketing material and symposia and advertising monographs. And if you make the study data go through their marketing message, which are not scientifically determined, they're marketing determined, then you get key messages aligned. And then you can take the study data and it will promote your drug sales because it will support your key messages. Now, this was not just theoretic. Again, from litigation. This is draft 2 of an article from, you can see here, MAC is Medical Arts Communication, has been hired by Pfizer to create a review paper on neuropathic pain dosing with Neurontin on how doctors should do that. Now, Pfizer knew that its clinical trial data did not support the use of gabapentin or Neurontin for neuropathic pain. They knew that because the FDA, they took their data to the FDA to file for an additional indication for neuropathic pain, which would sell a whole lot of drug. That's the holy grail of pain medicine, is neuropathic pain. They took their studies to the FDA, and the FDA wouldn't even let them file an application. Their data was so weak. So Pfizer did the right thing, and they hired 3 consultants, and they brought the 3 consultants in. And again, as a consultant in litigation, I got to see all of these documents, that what really happened. They brought these 3 consultants in, they showed them the real data, and they said, what can we do to get FDA approval for Neurontin for neuropathic pain? And the answer of their 3 consultants was, you're done. The data doesn't support it. You can't do it. It's not right. It doesn't help. And I don't have time to go into the specifics of why doctors think that it helps, but it doesn't. And I'm like, if somebody wants to ask a question about that, we can take a deeper dive into it. But here, Pfizer's hired Medical Arts Communication to help them write a review article that will show doctors what they know the FDA denies and their own consultants deny, to get doctors to prescribe Neurontin as a treatment for neuropathic pain. This is the second draft of Medical Arts Communications development of this, and they've got their key messages. And look at this. The manuscript is neuropathic pain dosing. The author is going to be Baconia, and Medical Arts Communication is in contact with Baconia, but he hasn't agreed to be the author yet. So the commercial ghostwriting outfit is in its second draft, and they haven't even gotten the author to agree to it. And what are their key messages? gabapentin is an anticonvulsant that has proven effective in the treatment of neuropathic pain. The FDA said no, their studies said no, and their consultants said no. And they want to get the patients right up to 1,800 milligrams a day, which is the maximum FDA allowed dose. And they say gabapentin doses up to 3,600, twice the FDA allowed maximum, have been proven well tolerated and effective in clinical studies. And this article was published in a journal. This draft is from, I think, 2001. The article was published in 2003. So, what's the real truth about new drugs? This is from the German Health Technology Assessment Agency, and it shows that out of 216 drugs, only 54 of 216 new drugs showed considerable or major improvement over previously available therapy. Only 1 out of 4 new drugs had a significant benefit. So you say, well, why don't doctors just learn what the 1 out of 4 drugs is and prescribe those and not prescribe the others? And the problem is that the United States does not have a health technology assessment agency. The other wealthy countries do. And they look at the data and they guide their doctors and they guide their insurance coverage based on the comparative efficacy of new drugs compared to the older therapies that are the standard therapies. But we don't have such a mechanism in the United States. We were the first country to have it. We had it in the 70s. But in Newt Gingrich's contract with America in 1995, they zero funded it. So the association between drug characteristics and manufacturing spending, this is an article was in JAMA in 2003, so it's just a few months old. And what this article found is that out of 135 new drugs, top-selling new drugs in the United States for which they could get data, 43 had high added clinical benefit, and more than twice as many, 92, had low added clinical benefit. So you might ask, well, how did the authors know that when you can't get that data in the United States? And the answer is they took the health technology assessment data from France and Canada and put it together and found that less than a third of the new drugs had high added value. But here's the problem. Drugs are so expensive in the United States and marketing is so open, Wild West, that the drug companies can spend whatever they want. So they spend 3 times more on their low added clinical benefit drugs than they do on their high added clinical benefit drugs. And the doctors don't have no way to sort this out. They don't know. So without a formal mechanism of health technology assessment, US doctors can't identify which one of the 4 drugs is truly better than previously available therapies. And because the prices are so high in the United States, 3.5 times more than the cost of brand name drugs in other OECD countries, the drug companies can spend so much on marketing that the new drugs diffuse out into public use much more quickly than in other countries. And the end result is between 2/3 and 3/4 of all drug profits, of global drug profits, come from the United States. So here's a question. I want you to write down your answer to this question. In 2008, a newly launched drug cost the median price of a year-long supply of a newly launched drug cost $2,115. I want you to take a pen and write down what you think that cost was in 2021. Take a guess, put it on paper. And now I will show you. I would like to hear your gasps, but I can't hear it. In 2021, the median annual cost of a new drug had gone from $2,000 to $180,000. That's how fast things are changing. And 2021 wasn't a quirk. In 2022, the price went up to $257,000. So now we get to the heart of the matter, because remember, this research is being done to maximize the return on investment to the investors who are funding this research and owning the stock. Jill Lepore is a professor of history at Harvard. She wrote a book called These Truths: A History of the United States. And she was talking about innovation, how the concept of innovation was brought in to the lexicon many years ago. And she says, innovation might make the world a better place. We assume when we hear the term biotech innovation, that is a priori, on the face, a social good, that innovation in biotech is a good thing. What Jill Lepore explains to us is that innovation might make the world a better place, or it might not. The point was, innovation was not concerned with goodness. It was concerned with novelty, speed, and profit. So innovation in the United States being the only country that doesn't control the price of drugs, so we give patents and we let drug companies own monopolies on their new drugs, but we don't control the price. So this innovation is being taken, just the sky's the limit. So here's why we don't see what's going on. We think of a market that sells what's called experience goods. This is the market that Adam Smith described in the 1770s, where consumers can go to the market and they can test and taste and compare the price, and they can agree to purchase drugs of an acceptable quality for a fair price. So there's a supply of the drug, and the butchers and the brewers and the bakers bring their stuff to the market, and the consumers come to the market and they can taste them and sample them and compare prices. There's symmetry of information and a negotiated price. And that's the way the market that Adam Smith described, that's going to optimally distribute goods and service to the benefit of all people in society. That's the way it works. The problem is that biotech innovation, doesn't produce experience goods. It produces credence goods. With credence goods, consumers can't test the product. They can't determine the value of the product to them, and they can't compare the comparative price. They must depend on information from experts. And in the case of drugs and devices, those experts are the commercial companies that manufacture those products. They have the information. So it's not supply and demand. It's supply. Let me find my mouse. So it's not supply and demand being interactive. It's that the supply is determined by the information that's claimed by the manufacturer, who now, as we see, controls the studies, controls the write-up of the studies, controls the academic medical centers who do some of the research. And that information, not the actual qualities of the product, but that information creates the demand. So we've got complexity, which puts the consumers and the doctors in an underdog position in comparison to the manufacturers. Prices are not negotiated. This is singular in the United States, and it's craziness that we grant monopolies but don't negotiate prices. Insured consumers pay only a fraction of the cost, so price discipline doesn't work. And as we've talked about in the previous slides, there's asymmetry of information, there's non-transparency of clinical trial data, and there's lack of oversight of the integrity of medical knowledge through health technology assessment mechanisms. So now we turn to guidelines. And doctors are implored to practice guidelines, and guidelines can be produced in malpractice cases. So doctors really have to follow guidelines. In 1999, there was an article about guidelines that showed that only 43% of guidelines comply with the standards for guidelines. And in 2011, the Institute of Medicine went back and looked at this, and they found that certain factors were common in undermining the quality and trustworthiness of clinical practice guidelines. And two major ones were limitations in the systematic reviews upon which the guidelines are based. because the systematic reviews don't have access to the real data, and the experts who write those reviews don't have access to the real data. And despite all efforts, conflicts of interest have not been squeezed out of the clinical practice guidelines. So in 2011, the Institute of Medicine recommended that the National Guideline Clearinghouse post on its website, the trustworthiness of the clinical practice guidelines that it had on its website, so that the doctors could know whether the guidelines were following guidelines for guidelines. So soon the National Guideline Clearinghouse became the go-to place, and they were getting, as we got into 2017, the National Guideline Clearinghouse was getting 200,000 hits a month with doctors and consumers looking at guidelines. The IOM had made the recommendation that the National Clearinghouse add a comment about the trustworthiness of the guidelines. And this is from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and they said that they were going to implement the recommendation of the IOM in 2017. Sorry, I lost my mouse, but you can see the bottom of this slide. Determining and posting assessments of the extent to which guidelines accepted for inclusion in the National Guideline Clearinghouse adhere to the IOM standards will begin in October 2017. And now if you look at the top of this slide, this was posted in 2018. The Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality National Guideline Clearinghouse website will not be available after July 16th, 2018. Why? Because federal funding through the AHRQ will no longer be available to support the National Guideline Clearinghouse as of that date. In other words, the AHRQ was doing an incredible service, excuse me, for doctors and patients to tell them how trustworthy each guideline was. And the AHRQ's reward for providing that information to doctors and consumers was to get zero funding, their funding taken away, and have the program canceled. So doctors don't have access to independent assessment of the integrity of the guidelines. So where are we? 86% of clinical trials are now commercially funded. 97% of the most frequently cited articles are commercially funded. Compared to non-industry sponsored studies, industry-sponsored trials have significantly more favorable efficacy results, harm results, and overall conclusions. And remember, we do not have health technology assessment, so doctors can't find out the extent to which the representations made in the articles are accurate. The majority of physicians' CME is funded by industry, and 59% of the authors, despite decades of saying that authors of clinical trial guidelines should not have financial ties to the companies whose products they're writing about in the guideline, 59% of authors of expert guidelines have financial ties to an interested manufacturer. So I think I'm going to skip this part. If anyone's really interested, ask me in the questions, but I wanted, the next few slides are about Leqembi or lecanemab, which is the new Alzheimer's drug that was approved in January 6, 2023. And it was approved based on the way that it helped slow the progression of mild Alzheimer's disease by 27%. But to cut to the chase, this 27% reduction, the difference between progressing 1.66 points on an 18-point scale, and 1.21 points on an 18-point scale in the people who were treated with lecanemab, a 27% reduction. An editorial written in The Lancet stated that a 0.45 difference, that's 121 subtracted from 1.66, a 0.5 point difference on the clinical dementia rating scale, an 18-point scale, might not be clinically meaningful. A 2019 study suggested that the minimal clinically important difference on the clinical dementia rating scale is 1.63. So this 27% improvement in the progression of mild Alzheimer's disease turns out to be about 1/4 of the meaningful amount of difference to make a clinical difference in people's lives. And it's got plenty of adverse events. And it's going to cost $26,500 per year. The manufacturer thinks 100,000 people will be prescribed this drug, and it'll cost $2.65 billion a year. The number of serious adverse events associated with this drug, you have to treat 37 people, just 37 people, 1 out of 37 people treated with this drug, compared to a placebo, are going to develop a serious adverse event, and these events are serious enough to require hospitalization. So here we have a drug that's going to do clear-cut harm, and in the adverse events that are not serious, you only have to treat 4.4 people to cause an adverse event. So we have a drug that's going to cost $26,500 per year, not have a meaningful clinical benefit, and will cost the United States taxpayers a total of $2.65 billion while it's doing more harm than good. Meanwhile, targeting 12 risk factors may delay or prevent up to 40% of Alzheimer's disease, dementia cases, but we don't do that. We don't do that because the medical research, again, is pointed at developing expensive drugs instead of epidemiologically relevant therapies. Now, this is the clear point. We're coming around to the home stretch of this. This is a lot of information, but this is the real point about why the United States has so much worse health and worse results from its healthcare than do the other wealthy countries. This is a chart that shows the total health service and social service spending in OECD countries. You can see the OECD average. This is expenditures as a percentage of GDP. The OECD average is countries are spending 9.4% of their GDP on healthcare and 16.9% of their 16.6% of their GDP on social services. But when we look at the United States, we see that that ratio is reversed. Instead of spending so much more on social services than medical services, we spend so much more on medical services than social services. And what we find is that the average ratio of social service to healthcare expenditures for OECD countries is 1.8, almost twice as much spent on social services, but less than half as much in the United States, 0.83 in the United States. So we've reversed the ratio of spending on medical and social services. What the study found is that the ratio of social to health expenditures adjusted for GDP per capita was significantly associated. Now, this is more social spending, the ratio of social spending to health spending. Doesn't matter how much you spend, but it's just the ratio of social spending to health spending. When that ratio is higher, you get a higher life expectancy, lower infant mortality, and fewer potential years of life lost, although it was associated with an increase in low birth weight. And what the authors concluded is, our findings suggest that the paradox, this is the framework of my talk, that the paradox of high health spending without improved health outcomes within the OECD countries may be informed by differences in spending in social service areas. That what they're talking about is the United States without saying it. Our findings suggest that the paradox of high health spending without improved health outcomes in the US may be informed by differences in spending in social service areas. Reforms that target only health expenditures may miss out on important opportunities. Now, things are going to go from bad to worse, so we're at risk of things going from bad to worse very quickly. The budget cuts that are proposed in the GOP plan to contain the debt ceiling are going to be about $500 billion per year cut out of all discretionary spending except for defense, veterans health benefits, and homeland security. So half of the budget of education, of housing and urban development, of HHS, half of those budgets are, the Republicans are proposing that those budgets get cut in half to save $500 billion a year. That's exactly what we need to be spending more on to make Americans healthier and to save money in our healthcare spending. But we're going to make these draconian cuts, 51% cuts in those social determinants of health, in order to save $500 billion a year, when we're wasting more than 4 times that each year on our excess health spending. So if these budget cuts go through, it's going to be a giant step in the wrong direction that's already devastating Americans' health and healthcare. So what we have, just to sum up what I've been talking about, is pharma is at the middle of this market failure in medical knowledge. Pharma has financial relationships with medical journals. It has financial relationships with academic medical centers. It has financial ties with the regulatory agencies, including the FDA. It has financial ties with the guidelines, with patient advocacy groups, with nonprofit organizations. So in each of these situations, each of those bilateral relationships, pharma's making money, and these other entities are making money, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, they're making money. And that's the definition of a market failure. The medical journals aren't going to demand that the data be submitted because they'll make less money. That's a market failure. Medical journals make money by doing it. Pharma makes money by doing it, but the American people are cheated by doing it. And the only way to get out of a market failure like this is to have government intervention. Now, government intervention is a problem. And when I started this project 20 years ago, I was firmly on the progressive side of things and thought government could and should fix things. Right now, the progressive side's not very interested in what I have to say, and the conservatives are starting to pick up what I have to say, but they don't want government intervention. They want markets to straighten it out. They understand that the markets aren't straightening it out. And at this point in time, what we've got to do is get conservatives and progressives together to find out what our common ground is so that we can correct this market failure by imposing regulations on pharma and these other companies that take pharma's money, so that our healthcare system gets reoriented to provide better healthcare and better to create the social environment that creates better healthcare and higher quality of life. So what do we do? How do we move forward? Number one, we have to accept pharma's true role in society. Now, this is not complaining and it's not accusing. The simple fact is that pharma's primary responsibility is maximizing investors' financial return on investment. And complaining that they're greedy is like complaining that zebras have stripes. It's in their DNA, that's what they are, and that's what they do. And pharma's primary strategy to achieve that goal is controlling healthcare professionals' beliefs about their products. Now, that's their job. And their responsibility is to their investors. So what needs to happen somehow, in some way, is for guardrails to be put on pharma's marketing and pricing and communications so that society is served by pharma using its expertise and the contributions that it can make. But without those guardrails, pharma has a responsibility to its investors to squeeze out just as much money as they can from the United States without a ceiling. And the median annual cost of new drugs in 2022 may be $250,000 now, but you can be sure that if this isn't stopped, it's going to keep going up. Now, Milton Friedman, the conservative, arch supporter, archetypal supporter of free markets, wrote back in 1962 that government should do almost nothing, that a free society is going to prosper and create the greatest amount of happiness if government gets out of the way and lets business do its thing. But even Milton Friedman said there are 3 things government should do. It should preserve law and order, it should enforce private contracts, and it should foster competitive markets. Now, I served as a consultant to the FDA and the Department of Justice in a case involving a drug like Vioxx called Bextra. I learned about it in civil litigation, and I could take what I learned after I was subpoenaed by the FBI to testify. I could take that information to the FBI and the Department of Justice. And after I testified, 6 months later, there was a press release from the Department of Justice that said that Pfizer had been fined $1.1 billion, that was the largest criminal fine that had ever been levied in the United States for a felony. And you might think that getting targeted with that would change things. But it gives the illusion of the preservation of law and order to get tagged with a fine that big. But what happens is Pfizer was able to let one of its subsidiaries take the felony plea and pay the money. So Pfizer didn't get tagged with that, and Pfizer didn't get risk getting kicked out of Medicare. And it's just a show of preserving law and order, enforcing private contracts, and enforcing competitive markets. There's just a show. The government isn't even doing the only three things that Milton Friedman said it needed to do. And if we would just do those three things, we'd be halfway home. The second step in reform is that we need to restore the epidemiological balance in medical research so that the research that's paid for with public and private money is designed to best improve Americans' health and quality of life. We need to ensure the accuracy and completeness of the evidence base of clinical care, which requires, among other things, transparent peer review, and the American people and American doctors who have the responsibility of acting as learned intermediaries have accurate information. The United States needs to implement health technology assessment so that doctors and patients and insurers and businesses can understand which of the new drugs have added value, meaningful added value, and what they're worth. And finally, it's ridiculous for us not to control the price of brand name drugs when it's essentially an unregulated monopoly utility, because we give patents and we allow the drug companies to charge what they want and control the information that doctors get, and yet the prices aren't controlled. So doctors require this information to act as learned intermediaries, and true reform will require a coalition that includes the public, healthcare professionals, and businesses that purchase health insurance for their employees. Now, why aren't we getting there? It seems pretty straightforward. This is not rocket science, and we're not getting there because the one thing that our Congress is truly bipartisan about is taking money from the pharmaceutical industry. In 2020, 189 Democratic candidates and 214 Republican candidates received about $7 million worth of pharma money, and that money protects pharma from the regulations that we need to have. So none of these reforms can happen until the political influence of the manufacturer's financial resources is curtailed. And healthcare professionals, government officials, and most importantly, the public understand how our healthcare system has become a servant of industry and not the reverse. And finally, the thought I want to leave you with is that nothing will happen until all stakeholders become activists. Once you understand what's going on, please become an activist. Maybe that means talking to your family about this. Maybe it means talking to your friends about it. Maybe you're a good writer and you want to write in the local newspaper. Maybe you can get onto podcasts and talk about it. But until it becomes polite to talk at all levels, from social interaction to professional communications to academic medical centers, until it becomes polite to talk about this crisis of 500,000 Americans dying unnecessarily each year because of the inadequacy of our health and healthcare, nothing's going to change. So thank you very much, and I look forward to addressing your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Doctor. That was a very, very powerful and enlightening presentation. We're now going to begin our live Q&A. Before we begin, we'd like to make sure that everyone knows how to connect with you and follow you on, through social media, et cetera.
Connect to me.
Well, just kind of like follow your work. Not
to follow my work. I have not gotten into social media, I confess. I do a lot of podcasts. You can Google me. You can search for me on the internet. You'll see the Joe Rogan show and the Lex Fridman show and a lot of stuff. And if you want to email me, you can email me. I want to say that what I'm talking about is in my book, Sickening. And I would implore you to read it. This tells the story. It's been blacklisted. I shouldn't say that. For some reason, the mainstream media has not covered this book. And you need to read this. Right now, I don't think there's anything else like this out. If you can't afford this book, write to me and I will send you a manuscript, a PDF manuscript of the book. And you can just write to me at my email address, johnabramsonmd@gmail.com. And I'll send you a PDF. But it's just so imperative for you, for your children, and for your children's children that we start to make progress on this problem.
Great. Thank you very much for that. So thank you for sharing that. So we will now begin the Q&A session. We will be asking questions of the presenter. And if the audience has questions, we'll open it up to them as well. We will first just explain to everyone how this works. We don't take questions directly from chat. Instead, we ask everyone to virtually raise their hand. If you're not sure how to do this, what you need to do is click on the reactions button, second from the right at the bottom of the Zoom window, then click on the raise hand function in the menu that pops up. When I call on you, I will unmute you and ask you to state where you're from and to ask your question. And we ask that everyone keep their questions brief and on topic. So let's see here. So I'm going to ask you some questions to start. So you went into obviously the issues with clinical trials, and yet we're told. Sorry for that beep. We're told that they are unbiased gold standard for accurate and honest information on the results of perfectly designed drug trials. Then we're told the medical journals carefully check them over again before publishing the results of them. How does this not get out? How does your message not become public? And what exactly is? That's basically the question.
Okay. So I think the short answer, Michael, is that the distribution of information in general society has a lot to do with the distribution of power. And this story, some of this story is available. Much of it takes, you have to be devoted. I've been devoted to this issue for 20 years. I've 24/7. I have worked 7 days a week for many years. What's happening is that the criteria, this idea that knowledge is defined as a justifiable belief, and what's happening is that not just doctors and other healthcare professionals, but the public at large is being trained subtly in the paradigm, like learning a paradigm, that the sources of information bring that impeccable clinical trial study and bring that impeccable write-up in the journal and bring those impeccable guidelines to you and your doctors so that you can have the best medical care in the world, when in fact the longevity of Americans is now what the longevity of 10 other wealthy countries was in 1987, and we're spending 10 times, 12 times more per person to achieve that. And we're not even allowed to have this discussion. So I just have to thank you and Stephen Shore and all the folks who are putting on this conference for allowing, for giving air to this problem, which is, I believe, the largest problem that the United States is facing, not just in health and healthcare and quality of life, but it's going to bankrupt us. We're going to default on our debt. And there's $2.3 trillion a year leaking out of our healthcare. It's craziness. And we've got to realize that what we think of as knowledge, as a justified belief, is we've been trained to accept the criteria of belief that aren't trustworthy. We've got to transcend that. It's hard work. That's why I wrote this book. And again, if anybody can't afford it, I'll send you a manuscript. I'm not in this for the money. I'm in this to try to help people understand information that we can't get out over the airwaves.
Okay.
Oh boy. Hello?
Hello, please state where you're from and ask your question.
Yes, I am from California. My question is, what do you know about Zoloft and Trazodone?
Well, trazodone is an earlier antidepressant. It's been on patent forever. I think it was on patent, went off patent sometime in the 80s. Zoloft is one of the newer generations of antidepressants, which is a serotonin uptake inhibitor. Trazodone, most of the use of trazodone when I was in practice in the 80s and 90s was for a side effect of trazodone to help with sleep, which it does pretty effectively. The serotonin uptake inhibitors like Zoloft and Prozac and the other drugs help about 1 out of 4 people who are suffering from a major depression. Major depression is a serious illness. People with major depression aren't able to function in normal life. They don't want to leave their house. They want to stay in bed. They don't want to get involved with normal social relationships. They don't want to go to church or their social affairs. That's a serious problem. And if you have a 1 out of 4 chance of helping somebody, I think it's a good risk to take. But the antidepressants are not, the serotonin uptake inhibitors are not effective for moderate or mild depression. Yet they're used, the vast majority of the drugs are used in that context, and particularly for children. I mean, we know that there's a risk of suicidality. That slide that I showed you about Pfizer saying they own the data and they're going to use it for marketing, that came from a case of somebody who had committed suicide while taking Zoloft. The suicidality in adults, it looks like it's a risk. I don't want to comment one way or the other. I don't think the courts have firmly determined this, but there is a suicide risk in kids, and that's really serious, and that hasn't been made public. I mean, there's a big movement to diagnose kids as depressed or having other disorders for which the serotonin uptake inhibitors would be helpful, and the increased risk of suicidality has been minimized, especially in kids and adolescents.
Thank you, Doctor. Next question is coming from Roger. Roger, please state where you're from and ask your question.
I'm Roger Test, Cokeville, Wyoming, doctor of pharmacy from the University of Southern California, practiced pharmacy for 46 years. And I think that sickening, as I'm reading it, I find that you seem to trust the drug industry, the drug manufacturers more than I even do.
How so? How so?
My question is, if you had the authority to do one thing, what would you do to help correct the situation?
One thing is hard, but I think the first thing that I would do would be to create a health technology assessment agency in the United States, parallel, not in the FDA and not subservient to the FDA, but parallel with the FDA, because the FDA tells doctors what drugs they can prescribe, what drugs they're legally allowed to prescribe. It doesn't tell them which drugs are best or most effective or efficient to prescribe. And I would have a health technology assessment agency that had access to the primary clinical trial data and the resources to analyze that data and the funding to get their information out so that the journals were no longer in control of representing the results of clinical trials, so that doctors could get their information from a health technology assessment that independently assess the results to make sure they show what they should, and also that this health technology assessment agency would have oversight responsibility for a balanced research agenda, so that instead of having 96% of our research and new knowledge about drugs and devices, our new knowledge would be proportional to what would best help Americans achieve healthier and higher quality lives. And we know that about 20% of that determination is healthcare and 80% is social factors. So if you just gave me one shot at it, Roger, you can't do it with one shot, obviously, because you got to get money out of politics and you got to do a lot of things. But if you just gave me one shot, it would be to have that health technology assessment to inform doctors and patients and businesses that are purchasing healthcare on what the best healthcare would be.
Thank you. So you mentioned, final control of the results. So who has final control of the results reported from the clinical trials to the medical journals and doctors? Is it the drug companies or the academics or someone else?
No, it's the drug companies. That slide from Pfizer, it was telling the truth, Michael. They own the data, and you can't get the data from them. They'll submit it to the FDA, and they rarely lie. I've seen a case where I think data was misrepresented, but they rarely lie to the FDA, but the FDA won't release it, and the FDA won't correct journals. I've spoken with a high FDA official at a faculty medical ethics seminar at Harvard. I asked this official why they didn't correct an article about Celebrex that grossly misrepresented a clinical trial. And she said, it's not our job to correct journals. So they're not doing that. All they do is tell doctors what drugs they can prescribe. Now, that said, there's a lot of information in drug labels. And if there are healthcare professionals who would like to have a separate Zoom meeting about how to read drug labels, I would be happy to do that with you, because there's a lot of good stuff in there, and not many people understand how to make it rapidly accessible.
Thank you. So what, I'm sure this is kind of hard to quantify, but what percentage of doctors' advice to patients comes from the information they learn from these clinical trials and medical journals?
For a good doctor, it's 100%. They're supposed to practice evidence-based medicine. And the drug companies have a total chokehold on what's defined as evidence-based medicine. And if we walk away with one slogan that summarizes it, is you can't have evidence without data. There's no evidence without data. And doctors think they're practicing evidence-based medicine, but they don't have direct or indirect access to the data. It's a sham. It's a complete sham. And the docs don't understand it, and the people don't understand it. And what we've got to do, Michael, the first step is to make this conversation that you and I are having right now acceptable in polite company. We've got to be able to say this. We've got to inform ourselves about it and say that this situation is completely broken. And the United States is wasting $2.3 trillion a year, and an extra 500,000 Americans are dying every year. When we hear about these miracle drugs that are going to save a life or 2 or 20 from a terrible genetic disease. And God knows, if it were my kid, I'd want to spend all the money in the world on that drug. But we're going to focus on these enormously expensive drugs for small numbers of people when Americans are living 6.3 years less than the people in other wealthy countries. It's just complete craziness. We're a third world country from a medical point of view. And we've got to take action, because the drug companies aren't going to give up their privileged position. The only way to make progress is for enough Americans to become knowledgeable about this, to influence their legislators more than drug company money influences their legislators. That's the only path out of this.
Thank you very much. And with that ends our Q&A. So thank you very much, Doctor. Please unmute the audience.
You can't.
Thank you, Dr.
Abramson.
Thank you.
You don't have to ask her to sign anything.
Oh, God, I wish I could have heard your energy while I was
Very
talking.
informative.
Thank you.
Attach
You're
your
the best.
phone to her.
Thank you.
Great. Thank